Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Entry Podcast. I'm your host, Francis Gorman. Before we dive in, if today's conversation challenges you, sparks a new idea, or sharpens how you think about the world, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who enjoys staying curious. Today, I'm joined by Sean Wiswesser, the former senior operations officer with the CIA. He served in multiple overseas tours and held senior leadership positions such as chief of station and served in joint duty assignments across the intelligence community. Sean is the author of the forthcoming book, Tradecraft, Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. It's out on the 21st of April, 2026, so make sure to check it out. The book examines the evolution of Russia's intelligence services, their fight against the West, and their role in modern hybrid warfare. Sean, it's lovely to have you here with me today.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you for having me. It's my first podcast with someone from one of my ancestors' homelands. And I visited the house. My great-great-grandfather was born in County Cork. That's why I'm named Sean. So it's an honor, Francis. Thank you.
That's why you're so good in the intelligence field, Sean. You've got that Irish blood running through you. Sean, it's lovely to have you here today, and I have the book here with me. It's been one of those reads that has made me pause, take a moment, and kind of reflect on the world we live in today. Can I ask you, what was your goal and objective with the book? Who is it targeted at?
Yeah, so thank you, Francis. It's if it does give you pause, then I've achieved somewhat my mission in writing the book. The book is for the general audience. It's for Americans, for the general public, and our allies across the world. It's meant to warn about and help to preempt and also disrupt the operations of the Russian intelligence services, who I believe, in my career of almost 30 years in the intelligence community, showed me they are certainly out um, to attack democracies around the world and subvert freedom of our countries and all of our allies. And so my mission is to expose them for who they are, to discuss their tradecraft and their tactics, so that we can better counter them. So that's why I wrote the book.
It's a very noble endeavor to take your life's work and then to sit down and put it on a page so others can learn from reading the book. The one thing that kind of struck me is the Russian intelligence service. It's a complex machine, and you talk about the evolution of the Russian intelligence service from its time under Stalin to what it is today under Putin. Can you go into that a little bit for me, and let's just
Yeah.
explore that for the audience, please, Sean?
So we have to yeah. Sure, Francis. We have to, of course, put the modern Russian intelligence services and their evolution in context, so we can better understand them. The book is 10 chapters on their tradecraft. It's not a memoir, although I do share some experiences I had with Russians, and it's not a survey of various, of one service or many services. Instead, it focuses on their tradecraft over 10 chapters in specific areas. But I start the book in the introduction, and then briefly in the first chapter, I talk about the organization of the services. One can't possibly understand the Soviet Union and the modern Russian Federation without understanding the critical and irreplaceable role, really, that the Russian intelligence services and the Soviet intelligence services have played in the functioning of the state. And I would argue the subversion of the state and the chance for a Russian democracy to really flourish. Since the Russian Revolution, Soviet Revolution of over 100 years ago, Francis, they've played the key role. They've been the drivers within the Russian state, and not in a positive form. Putin calls himself a Chekist. He uses the term Chekist, and he uses it like it's a compliment. The term comes from the Cheka, which was the Чрезвычайный комитет, the committee, the extraordinary committee for the defense of the revolution, basically. A lot longer term than that. It was the first intelligence service of the Bolsheviks after the revolution. And the model that they used, Lenin himself said, is you can't have revolution without terror. So he wanted to terrorize the people, and he picked Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the Cheka, to have that mission of terrorizing the Russian and other Soviet people so that they wouldn't possibly consider counter-revolution. Of course, there was a civil war then that followed the revolution, and indeed the Chekists practiced terror. You mentioned Stalin. After Lenin died and there was a brief period of some joint rule, Stalin eventually took over. Stalin emerged. And he used the NKVD, what followed on the Cheka, the NKVD, the OGPU, later the KGB after World War II. Stalin used them ruthlessly against the Russian people. Millions and millions of people died at the hands of the Cheka and then the other intelligence services of the Soviet Union. So that's their history. That's what Putin is proud of. When he reveres Dzerzhinsky, and this very day, Francis, these intelligence services celebrate on 20 December every year, Dzerzhinsky Day. They're celebrating bloodthirsty rulers who terrorized the Russian and Soviet people. I think that legacy is important because when Putin claims to the Russians, says that the Soviet intelligence and Russian intelligence services were always the elite of society, they weren't. In fact, they were just the ones that were destroying the chance for the Russian democracy and intelligentsia to thrive in their country. So it's a myth. It's a carefully cultivated myth that's evolved over the past 100 years. But there's certainly no denying that they've played very critical roles in Soviet and Russian history over the past 100 years. Hope that overview helps. We can talk about each service a little more if you like.
It does indeed, and I think we'll jump into the services as we go through the conversation. But I think it's important to call out one thing I got from the book is you have a deep appreciation for the Russian people and the Russian culture, but you've really focused in on the Russian intelligence services and the threat they pose to the West. Is that a fair statement that you're very fond of Russia in terms of what it brings to the table with its people and its culture, but very aware of the threat it brings in terms of its intelligence services and its government's lens on the Western
Yeah,
world, if that makes sense.
thank you, Francis. I appreciate that you picked up in the book, and you see the way that I wrote it. I have profound respect for the Russian people. I was a Russian literature major, 19th century Russian literature. Um, this is a rich culture, rich language. The people have contributed outstanding contributions to science and mathematics. Um, but unfortunately, they've never had a government really in modern times, going back hundreds of years. They've never really had a government and leaders worthy of the great Russian people. So when I studied there as a student in the 90s, I saw this. I saw a young, struggling democracy. Yeltsin did many things wrong, but he did a lot of things right. One of the things Yeltsin tried to do unsuccessfully was destroy the KGB. He briefly had a chairman named Bakatin who tried desperately to destroy this apparatus of state security, which had of course terrorized the people, and unfortunately Yeltsin failed in that mission, and very quickly uh, the security services again started establishing themselves and terrorizing the people as they continue to this day. Um, and so I think it's important, as you said, we don't lose track of the fact that we're not at war with the Russian people. I said that in my book. We're in an undeclared secret war with the Russian intelligence services because of their attacks against the West, that they're attacking democracies. And they've attacked in a kinetic military conflict, they attacked a democracy, Ukraine, which we are trying to support militarily as allies, and our European allies, of course, are trying to support. So Russia carries the burden of aggression. It's Russia, as I pointed out in my book, that's constantly attacking us. If I could share one anecdote, Francis, you read this early in the book. I mentioned I was starting my career as a CIA officer decades ago, and one of the Russian intelligence officers I met had schooled me as a relatively younger officer. I'd asked him, hey, after 9/11, why can't we all get along? Why is it that we keep learning and hearing? And this Russian intelligence officer was relating to me that America is still the GP. We're the glavny protivnik. We're the main enemy. And I asked him, as I related in the book, why is that? I don't understand. Shouldn't we all be cooperating against terrorism? And he said back to me, you were the main enemy ever since World War II. You are the main enemy now. You always will be. Don't make any mistake. For Russia, United States and its allies come first, above all else. And so this was a revelation even for me as a trained intelligence officer. There's no compromising with them. There's no collaborating against common threats. It's a zero-sum game. And Putin and his Chekisti, his siloviki, which means strong men that rule the country with him, that's their mentality. They're never going to consider themselves allies of the West or have anything in common with our vision of the world and our vision of democracies and freedom.
That's a really interesting point, and I was going to pick up and ask you about that, the officer who disclosed that to you during the book, because it did strike me as something that was worthy of a conversation. And when I look at the current government in the US's relation with Russia, there's a strange dynamic going on there that wasn't there before with Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin and Ukraine in the middle. do you think that that threat vector has shifted slightly, or if Russia are still have a very strong focus on undermining the West at every opportunity they get, and are using Ukraine war as one of those mechanisms to pull those levers, essentially in Washington?
Well, Francis, you mentioned one president, the current administration. My book's apolitical, as you know. I don't mention any of our U.S. presidents. I focus entirely on our adversaries. I think it's important to note my personal perspective, and I should mention all the views that I espouse now in this podcast and in the book are completely my own. They're not CIA's nor the U.S. government, and that disclaimer's in my book. Well, I think a lot of mistakes have been made with regards to Russia going back the past 30 years. Really, a lot of mistakes, successive administrations. I think the important thing to remember is that they are the adversary. Our focus should be on them, not on dividing and destroying ourselves from within. That's exactly what the Russian intelligence services want us to do with their active measures. And I think we'll talk in more depth about active measures later and how they practice misinformation and disinformation. So I think it's important to note that, for us in the intelligence services, my colleagues and I that I worked with over many decades, Putin is who we thought he was. He's a Chekist. Says so himself. He talks about it constantly. He reveres Chekist tradition. He is an autocrat. He believes that Russia needs to be led with a strong hand. There's a Russian understanding of the vozhd. This is a understanding going back to medieval times, even act the belief is that the Russian people have to be ruled by a strong leader like Ivan the Terrible, or Peter the Great. Constantly, you have to have these leaders that have a strong hold on the Russian people. I don't believe that. I believe the Russian people could thrive and have accomplished a lot more. There's a famous quote that's, I believe, attributed to Molotov after Stalin died. The inner collegium of the Politburo, the inner leaders were saying, what do we make of Stalin? What do we do about him? And of course, Khrushchev later condemned Stalin in the cult of personality. But one of the quotes, that it was either Molotov or one of the others, they were talking amongst themselves, and supposedly historical record says that one of them said, how could we judge Stalin? We might not have survived World War II without him. What would we have accomplished without him? And another one of the inner circle, maybe it was Zhukov, the general who famously was a hero in World War II, but one of them said, I don't believe that. I don't believe Stalin saved the Soviet Union. Think what we could have accomplished without Stalin. And that's my view. Without these dictators, without this autocratic society, without the disaster of the KGB running the state, think of the great things that the Soviet people might have accomplished, but we'll never know. So when Putin talks about the elite of Soviet society, remember, this was a broken system. And it's continued on in Russia now, completely corrupt, rampant corruption across Russia today, across the services or the intelligence services in the state. So it's a complete lie when Putin tries to claim they're the elite of society. They prey on society, really, Francis.
Those, I suppose, insights, Sean, are really important, especially in the geopolitical system that we find ourselves in today. The world is a fickle place, and you talked about democracy there and disinformation and undermining the American people specifically. In the book, you mentioned Fancy Bear, the hacking group that carried out the cyber attacks during the 2016 U.S. election. Can you speak to that to me for a minute?
Sure.
And what was the objective
Yeah.
there?
So the objective, Francis, and this is really important. This is lost a lot in the political infighting in my own country, which we really need to remember who are the adversaries and what they try to do. What the Russians were doing in 2016 was attacking our democracy and attacking the very concept of free and fair elections. Their goal was to undermine our democracy and our ability to go to the polls and the stations and vote for our candidate of our choice. You see, for Putin and his regime, and not only Putin, Xi Jinping in China is the same this is a threat to him just like it is to Putin. Functioning democracies with people that thrive in democracies, where economies thrive, like in the United States or the UK or Ireland, that's a threat to them. You can't have that. That's why Putin attacked and wanted to destroy Ukraine. He doesn't want the example of functioning democracies. Remember what the critical issue was for Putin that pushed him towards war, and his intelligence services pushed him into that corner and said, you have to go to war. It was Ukraine's entry into the EU, the fact that Ukraine wanted to proceed on the path to the EU and to deciding their own choices. So what they did in 2016, Francis, is a long tradition of what they call active measures, activные мероприятия in Russian. It's also called measures of support, is the modern term that the SVR uses, the Foreign Intelligence Service. So what they did is they decided they were going to use social media in a new way, using an old method, active measures. Active measures traditionally, Francis, they'll try to take a subject that's favorable to the Russian Federation, for instance, a country entering NATO or Ukraine wanting to enter the EU. They'll target journalists, academics, and others in society where they can get a favorable view of things. Well, back during the days of the Cold War, they would have to bribe journalists, or they'd have to win over an academic to their way of thinking. The Russians call it making use of a useful idiot, meaning someone's going to do their will, put out their views without necessarily being recruited. Well, in modern times, what changed in 2016, Francis, was they realized the incredible multiplying effect of using social media. So what Yevgeny Prigozhin, one of the oligarchs loyal to Putin, his former cook, did is he said, "Hey, how about if I help in this effort?" He volunteered to the intelligence services and said, "I'm going to set up this agency with a couple hundred or more of English speaking, very talented young people that I'm going to set up, and they're going to build social media accounts in the United States on Facebook and many other forms of social media. And we're just going to go in there and meddle and see how far we can get and what we can do." Now, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg was just one of many, many, Francis, that did this across Russia under the watch of the FSB, the SVR, and the GRU. They were all engaged in it. In fact, that group you mentioned, Fancy Bear, was hacking the American Democratic servers at the same time as groups from the FSB and from other intelligence services. So they weren't coordinating very well. What was their goal? Their goal was to sow discord, distrust, and animosity in the American public. Were they successful? All we need to do to realize they're successful is see that in 2020, the same discord continued. And to this very day, I saw news stories today about whether or not foreign governments from Venezuela or other countries managed to access voting machines. Did they change the vote count? Former Attorney General Barr said to the American public after the 2020 elections, when this was looked into, his words, it was bullshit. No voting machines were compromised. But what the Russians managed to do is they've unfortunately had a degree of success in getting the American people to distrust our very electoral system. And that was their goal, not for any one individual candidate. That was all incidental to what the Russians were trying to do. What they're trying to do is get us to question ourselves and question our ability to function in democracy.
Sean, you're echoing a lady I had on the podcast a couple of weeks back, Elizabeth Bullock. She spent 3 years on the front line in Ukraine. She's a British woman, trying to help Ukrainians that were disabled or at a disadvantage or had young families to get out of the path of the war zone. And one of the things that she came back to the UK and Ireland and other places is she's trying to get people to understand that Russia is attacking Europe, not just the Ukraine, and they're doing it through hybrid warfare. They're tampering with undersea cables, the disinformation, misinformation campaigns. They want you focused on immigration, she said, not on the core problems that surround you. That distraction element seems to have spilled out now from just being focused at the US and is peripheral across the entire Western continent. Would you agree with Elizabeth's
Oh,
analogy and
absolutely.
observations?
Yes, absolutely. I hadn't had a chance to listen to the other things Elizabeth said, but to that point, Francis, it's an old tactic the Russian and Soviet intelligence services have used for many, many decades. It's not just being used against the United States, it's all of Europe. I use the example, chapter 9 of my book, of course, is on active measures. I talk about the Brexit attack on Brexit. The Russians were doing the same thing as they were doing in the United States, and the UK government commented on that. Um, the most telling thing for me that I mentioned in the book is that when investigations were done, the bipartisan, at the time, bipartisan reports of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which include the current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, at the time was a senator. He signed off on that report. The DNI report, which represented the view of our entire intelligence community, what they all agreed with is that the Russians did this meddling in social media. And unfortunately, it reached millions and millions of potential voters. And what were they doing? Facebook pointed out, Francis, arguing two sides of the same issue at the same exact time. Well, if they're trying to get one candidate or another elected, you'd think they'd focus on one particular issue and argue just one side of it. The fact that they had their social media trolls, sitting and arguing both sides of an issue means they were just trying to amp up the emotion. They're just trying to get society against to be fighting within itself, and for our people to be fighting with one another. And then they insert narratives like this idea of Venezuelan voting machines that were tampered with. Again, Attorney General Barr said no truth to it whatsoever. It was investigated thoroughly. Unfortunately, this is still coming up now in 2026. We're still talking about it. It's very upsetting because I feel like the Russians can continue to get wins every time these false narratives keep getting played out. Um, I believe we do have free and fair elections. I don't believe anyone tampered with the voting machines. I believe the counts were correct and accurate, as has been testified countless times by many different states that run the elections in our country. But they sow that disunion for that distrust and for a reason, Francis, because they're trying to make us fractured societies, and they're doing it in Europe, of course, as well, across your continent as well in Europe.
And I think they're doing a good job of it at the moment. We do
Unfortunately,
seem to have,
unfortunately, yeah.
yeah, we do seem to have instability in society in the West, and I think the world in general is quite unstable at the moment. But that's a whole different topic to get into. Sean, one role that struck me in the book, the role of a cipher clerk. Can
Yeah,
you can
yeah,
can you can you
yeah.
talk to that for me for a minute? I thought this was
Well,
intriguing.
thanks for asking about that. You're the first, so credit to you, Francis. I've done a number of these podcasts talking about in the book. So in Russian, Shifrovalchik, he controls the enciphered communications for the Residentura. Residentura is the equivalent of a station. British or American stations overseas, CIA has stations overseas, of course. So for the Russians, it's a Residentura of the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, or the GRU, their military service. So Shifrovalchik is key to the operation, and he has to make sure the telegrams are coming and going encrypted communications to and from what they always call Moscow Center. So they call their headquarters in Moscow, whether it's the SVR or the GRU, they call it the center. And so I related in the story that, these code clerks, when we can recruit them in the West, they're a really big deal. I think I talked about the case of Guzenko, and Canadian defector to Canada early in the Cold War. He made a huge impact. So for the most part, the Russians in the Residentura, they keep these code clerks on a really tight leash. I mean, they don't even let them leave the embassy. Or if they do, they're allowed to leave in pairs. One of the stories CIA let me relate in the book that I put in there was having met a code clerk once early in my career. And I would love if the Russians are, let them waste a ton of time trying to figure out where it happened and when it happened. We leave it vague, of course, for that reason. But I had a chance to happen upon, I won't say how I happened upon, but one of these code clerks happened to have a hobby. He liked to play pool. And I happened upon him and challenged him to a game of pool. And we were deep into the game, and I was actually beating him when he realized I was an American. And then I introduced myself from the embassy. Well, both his and the other Russian that was with him, their eyes went wide. But he really loved pool, so he wanted to play desperately to play. So I beat him, and then that was really tough for him because he wanted a rematch, and the other guy was yanking him by the neck, really like, no, 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 we got to get out of here. We really, really, really got to leave. And I'm like, no, come on, please. No, you don't want a rematch? Come on. Let's for Международная дружба, international friendship. Let's have another game. So yeah, Shifrovalchiki are important targets for intelligence operations, and I related that kind of neat story. I remember I met one of them at least in my career.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love that. When I read it, I had to go back and kind of read it again so I fully understood the
But yeah,
context. But
they got back to the embassy. No doubt they had to write a long report about how they met the American, and then even worse when they realized, oh no, geez, Sean, is he an intelligence officer? Is he CIA by any chance? Yes, I am. If they didn't know it before, yes, I am now. Yes, you know.
spoiler alert.
Exactly. So sorry.
Sean, there's one thing I was thinking about when I was going through the book, and I find this sometimes myself when you start to put down your knowledge on a page. Sometimes it kind of taps into that back part of your mind or stuff that you forgot. You create this web of information, and it all starts to draw together. Did you find yourself starting to see patterns, or I suppose questions or answers you'd never thought of before as the words came onto the page? Is there anything there that you kind of stood back at the end of it and go, wow, not only do I have a lot of knowledge here that I've, collated over my career, but there's certain patterns, there's certain approaches or techniques deployed by Russia that are very apparent that I would have never thought about in the context before I actually put it on the page.
Well, one of the things that I'm proud of with the book, for instance, I mentioned it's a team effort. No intelligence officer ever does a job alone. Very proud of the fact that a former deputy director of operations, Mike Sulik, he wrote the forward to the book. And he noted that I do have a unique approach focused on tradecraft. Well, Mike Sulik, among many other great leaders at CIA, he was one that believed in CIA always holding what we said the gold standard of tradecraft. We always have, and I believe we always will. We try to protect our agents with everything we have, and we stand by our agents and their families when things go bad. So tradecraft is important. It's important to do it the right way. It's not that mistakes don't happen in the intelligence world; they do. I'm proud of the fact that I mentioned and I'm able to share many stories of colleagues that helped me and I worked with jointly in my career. You mentioned the joint duty assignments that I had. What occurred to me when I look back at sort of the long arc, focusing on tradecraft in particular, there are stark differences between we and the West. We work with our partners, we work with our allies, we work jointly. We do have a special relationship with your services in the UK. We're very proud of that. We have the Five Eyes intelligence sharing relationship. What does Russia have? In their country, as I talk about in the book, they hate each other. The FSB, GRU, and SVR, they despise each other. They can't work together to save their lives. They're constantly infighting and undermining each other. I mentioned in the case of the active measures, they were constantly one-upping each other, not collaborating. One was trying to hack the Democratic server. The other service was doing it at the same time. And FBI, in fact, uncovered the second one once they found the first one, as the reporting later showed. Let's talk about international allies. How good of an ally is Russia for Venezuela, really, when it mattered, when it really counted? They weren't there at all for Venezuela. They don't care about Venezuela. How about Iran? How's Iran doing with that, great strategic partnership with Russia? Not going so very well for it, is it? Is it? So Russia doesn't care fundamentally about allies or relationships. We do. It's a strength of the United States. I believe it always will be. I believe that our relationship in NATO is strong enough. It can sustain any U.S. administration, any administration of any of our countries. Remember, there are some in Europe right now who are not great fans of the partnership with the United States or not fans of supporting Ukraine, which I feel very strongly about in the book. As you know, we should be supporting Ukraine. Nowhere is it so stark a contrast between freedom and those trying to oppose freedom as in Ukraine. So I think that's what stands out to me. Our strength is in our collaboration, our partnerships, our allies, and those relationships. And with the Russians, they don't have that, Francis. And there's other things we can talk about, like the fact that not only do they not have a gold standard, most of the time it's a drunken standard of incompetent operations. And I give plenty of examples in the book of that. We can talk about some if you like.
One example that stood out to me when you talk about this kind of behavioral aspect of the Russian intelligence services, you touched on corruption. And there, my reading of it as a layperson looking in, be it I'm grounded in security and cybersecurity and have a good awareness of geopolitics, is it was every man or woman for themselves, particularly man in this case, I believe, based on some of your analogies. But how rife is corruption and that dominant aggression within the Russian intelligence services?
Yeah, it's fundamental to everything that they do, Francis. Unfortunately, all of their operations, even some of their better operations, and I begrudgingly give some compliments to the Russians in the book. I try to be true and accurate, things that they're good at and things that they're a disaster and they fail at quite a bit, and they fail often. But corruption bleeds through everything that they do, and their operations, as it were, are are fruit from a poisoned tree, as I said in the book, because they're constantly focused more about themselves, both their services and then individually. I start the book, I quote the defector Sergei Tretikov, who I had the privilege to debrief extensively. I mentioned him at a few points in the book. One of the things early on I mentioned, if you recall, Francis, in chapter one, I talk about the structure a little bit, but I don't want to bore the reader too much, so I try to share some stories right away about Russians. What are they really like? Well, as Sergei Tretyakov related, the entire day is about corruption. The day starts with corruptions. Russian intelligence officers are thinking, "Hey, I gotta make some money on the side today. I gotta scam. I gotta do something to make some money." And sometimes it's on a smaller level. I give the example: worldwide, Russians are always procuring electronics. Some of them are used for spy operations, but most of the time they'll buy twice as many and claim to Moscow that was the cost for half as many. They pocket the rest of them. They send them home. They sell them via the diplomatic pouch. This has just been going on for generations. At a larger level, I give the examples when they're dealing with regimes that have sanctions, like currently is happening in Iran, happened in Iraq before previously. The Russians will take care of large scale scams, like buying an entire tanker of gasoline during the Iraq War. And they weren't the only ones doing this. A lot of diplomatic missions were drive it across the border to Syria and sell it on the black market there and pocket the money. This is the kind of thing that Russian Residenturi, their stations are busy with these types of ridiculous scams all the time. Not my words. Sergei Tredecraft talks about it in his book, Comrade Gene, too. The corruption's just endemic to everything that they do. And it bleeds into their intelligence organizations. I can give other examples too, Francis, if you like. It starts at the very base level at their academies, even. If you like, I'll share that one anecdote from the book.
Yeah, please, Sean. Let's have it.
Yeah, so well, let's talk about here's an example at the training academy. A young Russian intelligence officer related to me, and I put it in the book. They're doing surveillance training, something I was very familiar with. I mentioned in the book. I'm an expert in that particular discipline, and CIA allowed me to mention that. I was retired out of the senior expert cadre and the director of operations. Well, I know I spent quite a bit of my career studying surveillance and counter surveillance. We'll just leave it at that. So I was always interested to ask Russians about that experience and learn from them and, of course, debrief their techniques. So I asked this young officer, so tell me about surveillance training at the academy. He said, well, we did our marshrut proverki, our surveillance checking route. That's what's called marshrut route proverki checking. So checking route for surveillance detection. I said, oh, how many foot exercises? Oh, you give, a few dozen. We worked against the FSB. And that led to another corruption story. But the first one that really shocked me, I said, well, what about vehicles? You got to get in the cars, right? I mean, you're going to use cars too. No, 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 no. We're not allowed to use the car. What are you talking about? Why you weren't allowed to use the cars? No, the gas in the cars we have to leave that for the instructors on the weekends because they're going to use them with their girlfriends, their lubovniki. Excuse me? You're not allowed to use the vehicles assigned to the students because the instructors get to steal them and take them away on the weekends. He's like, oh yeah, no, that was just normal. We didn't get to use the cars because the instructors take them for themselves and their girlfriend. Oh, okay. Well, then part two of the corruption. I said, oh, so he told me more about his training. And he said they worked against the FSB training teams, which they didn't like. They don't cooperate real well. Well, the students from the SVR were being evaluated. So were the students from the FSB. So he related at the end, though. I said, how'd you do? What were your marks? He said, well, I should have gotten Gadbalov. I should have gotten the very top A marks, but I didn't. Oh, what happened? Well, my instructor told me that the FSB team was being evaluated by their special evaluators, and I couldn't make them look bad. So he only gave me a B, said that I didn't see all the people that I said that I saw in the training surveillance exercises. And the FSB instructor gave him a case of vodka to pay him off. He gave me 2 bottles of it. So wow, I did quite a bit of instructing in my career at CIA. Our students thought they had it hard at CIA's training academy. I wonder how I would do explaining to them, hey, I'd like to give you the highest grades, but I can't because another instructor paid me off, and here's 2 bottles of vodka compensation. I mean, Francis, these stories, you just can't make this up. I mean, this is Russia at its very base, completely corrupt level. And the thing that struck me was this officer was told from the very get-go, hey, this is what your career is going to be like. That's what the instructor told him when he gave him the 2 bottles of vodka. Get used to it. You got to get along if you're going to make him this service. Thankfully, he decided not to get along. He made a better choice for himself and his family to eventually resettle in the United States. But I mean, these stories, that's a lot of people say they enjoy the stories, Francis, because he can't make that up. That's just too genuine for anybody that's lived in Russia. That type of corruption, again, bleeds into everything they do.
Yeah, I think when you read the stories, it definitely does help bring the world to life. It did for me anyway, Sean. When I was going through the book, when when I look at the world today, do you think Putin is more dangerous than he ever was?
I think so. Sadly, Francis, Putin reminds me in many ways of Hitler when he was in the bunker. Now, I'm not accused. The Russians have committed many atrocities in war in Ukraine, and they're continuing to commit them. I don't think it's an appropriate analogy to say that Putin is on the level of the atrocities committed by Hitler and the Nazi regime. But they're both criminal regimes carrying out aggressive wars without any justification whatsoever. The analogy I'm making specifically, though, what I want to focus on is when Hitler was in the bunker towards the end of the war, there wasn't a single general or any of his inner circle who would ever speak the truth to him. So nobody was speaking the truth to Hitler anymore. He had wiped out all opposition after the Valkyrie plot in 1944 when Stauffenberg and the other generals tried to kill Hitler. Unfortunately, they didn't succeed. Well, Hitler used it as a final purge against everyone in the military and society that could possibly stand against him. Well, so for the past 20 plus years, Francis, you've had a constant purging of also any opposition whatsoever inside Russia has been purged, or intelligentsia have left, or they've been killed, like Navalny was killed, and we know now that he was killed. Your government, Germans, and others have pointed out that we have conclusive evidence Navalny was killed. So were others. Anna Politkovskaya, a brave hero journalist, was killed. Many other Russian leaders were killed. Anybody that tried to oppose them. So in the inner circle, the scary situation now, Francis, is he doesn't have anyone speaking the truth to him. So I put the blame for the Ukraine war squarely on the lap of the Russian intelligence services. They carry the highest burden next to Putin himself for launching this unjust, horrible war of aggression, the largest suffering in Europe, largest scale war in Europe since World War II. It was the Russian intelligence services that talked Putin into it and said, hey, you can win, and we're going to help you win, and we'll have prominent roles in it. The FSB in particular, his old agency that Putin headed as director in the 90s. And so nobody's speaking the truth to him anymore, Francis. That's a really scary thing. Nobody's willing to say, hey, Vladimir Vladimirovich, maybe not such a good idea to go to war with a brother Slavic people, the Ukrainians, who, until that massive invasion in 2022, even after 2014, what had happened in Ukraine, there were still a lot of Ukrainians willing to think that they could live in peace with Russia, that maybe they could find a way, a middle path between Europe and Russia. Now take the poll numbers of how Ukrainians feel now. Now they know Putin and Russia and the current regime for exactly who they are. So that's, I think, the scariest thing, Francis. I just don't think there's anyone keeping him in check anymore, unfortunately.
And that is scary for Europe in general, I think, Sean. And it's a sobering thought to hold in our minds as we move forward into a world of unknown trauma. We seems to be new war every week the way things are going, but yeah, that just seems to be the world we live in. Sean, I always ask ex intelligence people when I have them on the podcast, for listeners out there who have a deep interest in this field and are considering a career in intelligence or foreign policy or national security, look back on your career. Have you got any advice you could give to those individuals?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Francis. Related in the book. I spent a lot of time, my 3 decades, almost 3 decades, government, and then some consulting contracting world still now. I've invested a lot into the next generation. I believe in it. I was an instructor within the intelligence community. I talk about that some in the book. I was joking with you about teaching at our some of our training academies. Um, so I believe that we need talented young people to enter government service in the UK and Ireland and our allies across Europe and across the world. It's no different than the United States. We need talented young Americans to say yes. You know, when called on, I'm going to serve. I'll serve my country. I'm proud that I served all over the world with CIA and the intelligence community. 12 years overseas, many different countries. I served in conflict zones, served in active war zones on more than one occasion. Um, I sometimes worry that current generation of Americans might be discouraged. We've had to do government cutbacks. I don't argue and debate those policies. I'm not a politician. What I believe, though, Francis, is that there's always a place for young Americans that want to serve their country. I encourage them to explore the intelligence community. There's some great career guides out there from CIA and other retiree organizations. I'm sure there's the same in the UK. For me, what I speak to a lot of high schools and colleges, trying to encourage groups to consider the intelligence community. I had a blast, Francis. I had good years and bad years, not just good weeks and bad weeks. A friend and mentor of mine from UNC Chapel Hill, his name's Dick Cohn, one of the best professors I ever had. I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning his name, but he told me when I started my career in government, he was a great mentor and friend. He said, you're going to have good years and bad years. And I always quote that. I said, it's true. Sometimes you have a bad boss or you have better bosses at different times. I had many more good years than bad years. I enjoyed my career thoroughly. I met my wife overseas. My sons got to live with us overseas. So I think it's a rewarding career. It's a challenging career to work in intelligence. We can't always get it right 100% of the time, but my colleagues and I in CIA and the other intelligence community colleagues I had the privilege to work with. And as you know, Francis, I dedicate the book to my colleagues, to my family, but also to my colleagues from the intelligence community that we fought within the fight, as I say in the book. It's a noble profession, and we need good people to serve.
Thanks, Sean. And I would say to anyone interested in the career to maybe pick this book up and give it a read. It's definitely a good knowledge source to, especially understand the Russian intelligence services if that is an area you would like to specialize in. Sean, before we finish up, you finish off with the epilogue in the book and kind of a nod to the hero spies. Do you want to just kind of finish off on that note, and
Yeah,
we'll talk about that for a second.
yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for asking that, Francis. I talk about it at the end of the book, in the epilogue. Just like we were reflecting on just now. It's a long career that I spent in intelligence around the world. I wanted there to be no mistake at the end of the book that there's um, my disdain and our disdain from CIA and my colleagues and I for the Russian intelligence services, how ruthless they are, what they've done to Russian society. But I have nothing but profound respect for the Russian intelligence officers who worked as assets for our community, for CIA and FBI and other joint cases that I worked. They risked their lives, many of them, and they risked everything, and not all of them succeeded. And I pay tribute to some of those cases in the book. I'll leave that to the readers. But for me, it was a profound sense of mission and respect for those agents that I always carried with me through my career. It really was an honor to work with them. Any of them that may hear my voice, if they've defected or not, I try to protect them very carefully in the book. I express that in the book. I say, there was this profound respect and appreciation for the sacrifices they made. I also relate in the book, it's important to reflect, Francis, the Russians I worked with who did make it to the US and are living in our country now with their families, they have a good life, but they never give up on Russia. There's things about Russia that they all comment on, they miss. And Sergei Tretyakov passed away sadly many, many years ago. He loved Russia. He loved the Russian people, culture, traditions. He just couldn't stand that there wasn't a worthy government, government worthy of the greatness of the Russian people. And he was willing to risk his life for it. Very talented man, a dedicated um, Russian who believed in the people, but not in the corrupt government. And he made a new life for himself and his family in the United States. So that's what the epilogue's about, and that was what my mission was about. Why I went to work for CIA and why I continued it for many decades is I was trying to help the Russian people in their quest for freedom, and I believe we still need to do that. At the same time, we need to present a credible deterrent, of course, against Putin and all of his designs against the West. So thank you for giving me a chance to mention that. And pay some respect to the Russian those Russians, not just intelligence officers, but of course agents of various professions that have risked their lives helping the United States and our allies.
No, I appreciate it, Sean. I think it's important. Like I said, my takeaway from the book was you have a deep respect for the Russian people and the Russian culture. So I think it's important that you also get to thank those who help serve um, the West in that regard. Sean, I suppose we've talked a lot about the book. You might as well tell people when it's out and where to get it, just in
Yeah,
case
yeah,
they
thank you.
want to.
So 21 April, it's available worldwide. It's available on Amazon, all of your major book sites in the U.S., Barnes and Noble, many other bookstores, private bookstores. In the UK, it's going to be available in paperback in the UK. Um, and so that's available in bookstores and via Amazon. Please order it now. It takes a little while sometimes, depending where you are in the world. It may take a week or two. In the US, it's usually immediately available. So starting 21 April, called Tradecraft Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. I hope you'll give it a chance. The book is about countering the malign influence of the Russian intelligence services around the world, and that's why I wrote the book. Francis, thank you. I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure to have you on, Sean, and thanks for coming on the show and sharing with us your knowledge and your experiences. I think the listeners will get a lot out of it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thanks very much.